Madeline Horton had lived a life defined by restraint, not the kind that came from fear or submission, but the type that grew like thick oak roots over decades of hard work, drought years, broken tools, silent mornings, and decisions made with grit rather than convenience. At 58, she stood at a point in her life where she no longer owed explanations. Not to anyone. Not to the people who'd whispered behind her back when she bought that 5-acre slice of land just outside Dry Creek Ridge, nor to the neighbors whose manicured lawns now pressed against the fence line like some creeping, uninvited weed. Her land had history. Some of it hers, most of it not. But it was hers now, and she treated it like something worth holding on to. The gate was the first thing she built with her own hands after settling in. It wasn't ornate or dramatic, just a solid, steel-framed structure she'd sourced from a salvaged equipment yard 2 counties over, reinforced with heavy wooden panels, sanded down and sealed under layers of primer before she painted it with a stubborn shade of burgundy, a deep, quiet red that shifted with the sun, sometimes looking like old wine, sometimes like dry blood. That was intentional. It was the exact same color that used to coat her late husband's tractor, a battered Massey Ferguson that he refused to let go of, even after it became more rust than machine. He passed 4 winters ago. Cancer. Quick and unkind. Madeline had buried him with dignity and silence and started building her world again, piece by piece, quieter but firmer. The gate, for her, wasn't decoration. It was a boundary and a marker, a statement without words. Here is where your rules stop and mine begin. When she installed it, there was no audience, no ribbon cutting, no welcome committee, just her and the quiet buzz of summer insects as she bolted it to the frame herself and then stood back to look at what she'd made. The gate didn't have an automatic opener or smart lock. It swung open on greased hinges and latched shut with a heavy drop rod that bit into the gravel like a spiked heel. And it did what it was meant to do, separate what was hers from what wasn't. The neighborhood had changed since she first scouted the area. Dry Creek Ridge used to be cattle country, with dusty roads, metal mailboxes on leaning wooden poles, and an understanding between neighbors that you handled your problems before the sheriff had to. But time did what it always did. Developers moved in, named things like Whispering Pines and Crescent Lane, started appearing on signs where there had once been simple coordinates. Suddenly, there were newsletters, HOA boards, and aesthetic guidelines. People stopped waving and started submitting noise complaints. Fences got higher, conversations shorter, and people like Madeline, who'd chosen land for the sake of solitude, found themselves increasingly surrounded by those who treated space like curated theater, not soil and sweat. She never joined the local committee, never saw the point. Her property technically sat just outside the official boundaries of the neighborhood governance zone, an old zoning quirk she was grateful for. She didn't attend meetings, didn't sign up for their group chats or download their apps. When she got a flyer on her porch inviting her to the annual block party, she dropped it straight into the burn barrel out back without reading it. Not out of malice, just disinterest. The neighbors could have their potlucks and guidelines. She had her routine, feed the dogs, tend the garden, do her maintenance checks, and enjoy the silence that came after a day of honest work. Then came the note. It wasn't mailed. It had no envelope. Just a plain, single sheet of printer paper folded once and slipped into the side of her gate like a passive-aggressive bookmark. On it, typed in a clean serif font, was a request. No greeting, no signature, just, "Your gate's color violates neighborhood aesthetic alignment. Please repaint in accordance with the approved color palette. Suggested options: ivory, soft slate, willow green." Madeline read it once, then twice. She didn't react, didn't tear it up or crumple it, just stared at the words like they were written in a different language. The paper felt flimsy in her hand, and the ink had started to fade where the sun had hit it. After a few moments, she folded it again, walked over to her fire pit, and let it burn without ceremony. She didn't talk about it with anyone, didn't post online. She just returned to her shed, pulled out her paint supplies, and retouched a few scratches on the gate, reinforcing the burgundy like fresh armor. That would have been the end of it, she assumed. But a few days later, a more official letter arrived. This one in a windowed envelope, delivered by the mailman, addressed to Occupant. It bore a logo in the top left corner, the seal of the local community board, and language that danced just short of legal threats. It informed her that multiple neighbors had expressed concern about the visual impact of her gate, that the color might be deemed disruptive or unwelcoming, and that failure to adjust it to the recommended standards could result in fines or administrative action. No definition of what that meant. Just the vague weight of bureaucracy, dressed in civility. She didn't ignore it. She scanned it, documented it, then sent a brief, polite email to the address provided in the footer. It read, "My property is not subject to your governance. I am not part of your association. My gate will remain as is. Kindly update your records." 2 days passed, no reply. Then someone began parking near her property line. A white sedan, clean and out of place, appeared a few mornings in a row, idling just long enough to be noticed, then driving off. Once, she stepped out with a thermos in hand and made eye contact with the driver, a blonde woman in her 50s with a clipboard on the passenger seat. She didn't wave. The car drove off again. The following week, Madeline came home from the co-op to find her gate covered in white primer splashes. Sloppy, uneven strokes across the panels, like someone had tried to start repainting it and then panicked midway through. No footprints, no note. Just the mess. She stood there, staring at it, the groceries still in the truck bed, and breathed in slowly. Not rage, not even surprise, just a kind of cold, methodical resolve settling over her like an old coat she hadn't needed in years. She cleaned the paint with solvent, sanded the streaks, and repainted everything by dusk. No statements, no posts, no calls. But that night she did one thing she hadn't done before. She installed a trail camera across the drive, mounted high in a sycamore, angled just right. Not to catch someone. Just to know. The next morning, she submitted a request to the county registrar to recertify her parcel boundaries. She didn't want disputes down the line, just clarity, clean lines on paper. She also asked her lawyer, a quiet man in town named Decker, who'd helped her with her title transfer 3 years ago, to draft a response in case further inquiries arose. He agreed, half amused and half cautious, saying, "People get weird when land's involved, even if it ain't theirs." Madeline didn't argue. What she didn't expect, though, was how quickly the next step would come. Not from a letter or formal notice, but from the unmistakable shriek of a horn and a cluster of voices at her gate the following Saturday. It was early, too early for guests. And there, half blocking her entrance, was the white sedan again, this time parked perpendicular across her drive. The president of the board had decided to make things personal. And Madeline Horton, who had spent most of her adult life avoiding fights that weren't worth her time, finally realized some boundaries had to be enforced the old way, quietly but decisively. The sedan sat like a provocation carved from steel and passive aggression, its pristine white paint catching the rising sun and throwing sharp reflections across the gravel road. Madeline Horton stood just inside her gate, one gloved hand resting on the latch, the other holding her thermos of black coffee, steam curling into the cold morning air like smoke from a starting engine. She didn't move toward the car immediately. Instead, she watched. 2 figures were visible inside, both women, one in the driver's seat, upright and stiff, the other hunched over a notepad, writing furiously as if preparing a battlefield report. The driver's side window was cracked just enough for a voice to carry through, and Madeline could hear fragments. Words like non-compliant, pattern of disregard, and potential ordinance extension floated out and mixed with the sound of distant cattle and wind. The moment felt rehearsed, and maybe it was. Madeline had seen enough political theater in her youth to recognize a staged provocation. This wasn't a neighborly chat. This was a message. She took a slow step forward, her boots crunching deliberately against the gravel. The driver noticed and stepped out. She was in her late 50s, thin in that sharp-edged way of women who mistake control for character, and wore a cream-colored blazer that didn't match the terrain. Her name, Madeline already knew, was Karen Tilby, chair of the neighborhood council and self-appointed guardian of community values. The woman extended a brittle smile, the kind used by people who file complaints before introducing themselves. "Good morning, Miss Horton," she said, adjusting a clipboard against her side like a badge of office. "I thought we might have a word, civilly, of course." Madeline didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of her coffee and watched as the second woman exited the car, clutching a folder and a stack of printed pages. They moved as a pair, clearly choreographed. Karen's assistant, Mira, judging by the whispered exchange between them, stepped aside and began setting papers on the sedan's hood, weighed down by a polished stone she pulled from her coat pocket. Karen gestured toward the gate behind Madeline. "There have been discussions," she said, as if revealing state secrets. "Your gate, its color, its design, its prominence, has become a source of considerable tension among the surrounding homeowners. You see, we try to maintain a coherent visual identity in this community. Earth tones, soft lines, unobtrusive structures. Your gate, well, it's rather declarative." Madeline gave a dry snort, barely audible. She didn't turn to look at the gate. She knew every bolt and panel of it better than she knew some people she was related to. She didn't need to see it to know it stood straight and unyielding behind her. Karen continued, undeterred. "We've conducted a preliminary vote among the Design Review Subcommittee. While you are technically outside the jurisdictional core, there are auxiliary provisions that allow for voluntary alignment with community standards. We can escalate to mandatory alignment if it becomes necessary, though that's a step we'd rather avoid. Conflict, as I'm sure you'd agree, is so unproductive." Madeline raised an eyebrow. "You're blocking my drive." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off course. Mira handed her a sheet of paper as if reloading a weapon. Karen took it, smoothed it once with her hand, and held it out. "This is a compliance suggestion packet. You'll find several pre-approved color swatches, as well as contact information for community-vetted contractors who can assist with repainting or replacing non-aligned structures. There's also a grace period for proactive adjustment, during which no administrative measures will be initiated." Madeline didn't take the paper. She didn't look at it. She looked at the car. Then she looked at Karen. Then she took another sip of coffee, slowly and deliberately before finally speaking. "You're trespassing." Karen's face tightened by a fraction of a degree, the smile slipping just a little before snapping back into place. "This road is a shared access point under municipal classification." "It's a recorded easement across private land," Madeline interrupted, not raising her voice but cutting through the air like a blade through canvas. "And you're parked beyond the easement marker, which makes this an intrusion, one that I'm documenting." With her free hand, she raised a small black remote and pointed it vaguely upward. A click. A soft beep from somewhere in the trees. Karen's eyes flicked toward the noise, then back to Madeline. The smile faded entirely now. "I tried to be courteous," she said, her voice cooling. "But you need to understand, we will not permit unilateral disruptions to the integrity of this neighborhood. You may think your land gives you freedom, But freedom doesn't mean you're above the social contract. If you want to live among others, you must. Madeline stepped forward, reducing the distance between them by half. Karen stopped talking. I don't want to live among others, Madeline said evenly. I want to live on my land, alone, without having to entertain strangers with clipboards. She turned her head slightly toward Mira. That includes junior associates playing reconnaissance. Karen's lips pressed into a line. This isn't over, she said, and gestured sharply for Mira to gather the papers. They loaded back into the car without another word. The sedan reversed awkwardly over the gravel and drove off, kicking up a small cloud of dust as it retreated. Madeline watched until they were out of sight. Then she turned, unlatched the gate, and pulled it open wide, the hinges singing that low, familiar groan that sounded to her like something alive. She didn't feel victorious. She felt like someone had just tested the fence for weaknesses and now knew where to press harder next time. By noon, another letter arrived. This one had an official header and was postmarked through the County Administrative Building. It stated that a petition had been submitted requesting an expansion of the neighborhood oversight boundary, citing community visual cohesion and resident distress. Attached were signatures, 15 names, some familiar, some not. The letter didn't demand anything, not yet. It just announced a review period and mentioned a preliminary compliance inquiry set for the following Thursday. Madeline didn't wait. She called Decker. He answered with a sigh and a "what now?" She told him everything. He asked her to scan the documents and forward them. He promised to reach out to the county office for verification and to prepare a cease and desist in case any action was attempted prematurely. They're overreaching, he said, but if they get county support, it becomes a procedural fight, which you can win, but it's slow. I don't want to fight, Madeline said. I just want them to leave me alone. Then don't blink first, Decker replied. You blink. They write your rules for you. The next few days passed without incident, at least on the surface, but Madeline began to notice details. Her mailbox was opened and left ajar one morning. One of her motion sensor lights was turned sideways like someone had manually twisted it. A pair of unfamiliar boot prints appeared in the soft earth near the northern fence line. Nothing she could prove. Nothing she could pin on anyone. But it was a message. And messages, Madeline had learned, were rarely sent without an intent to follow through. By Wednesday night, she had reinforced the hinges on the gate, swapped the bolts for tamper-resistant hardware, and laid a gravel path inside the fence to catch new tire tracks more clearly. She also placed a call to a local land surveyor and booked a private assessment. Not because she doubted her property lines, but because she wanted certified paper on her side when the next round of letters came. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would go from procedural to personal, or that by the end of the week she'd be hooking a chain from her tractor to the bumper of a white sedan blocking her exit and dragging it like dead weight off her land, silently, methodically, while the camera hidden in her tree caught every second of it. And even then, it wouldn't be over. Not even close. The sedan didn't return the next morning, and for a brief moment Madeline wondered if perhaps dragging it into the ditch had made a point strong enough to be respected. But experience quickly corrected that thought. Bullies, especially the organized suburban kind wrapped in layers of committees and council bylaws, rarely gave up after a single pushback. They regrouped. They documented. They struck again through channels too polite to scream, but sharp enough to cut. True to form, by Thursday evening, a manila envelope appeared in her mailbox. It wasn't hand-delivered, and it didn't come through regular mail. There was no postage, only her name in tight, square lettering and a wax seal bearing the insignia of the local residents' council. Inside was a printed letterhead document written in bureaucratic prose, all distance and pretense. It stated that a formal complaint had been lodged against her for reckless endangerment of private property, and that her removal of an obstructing vehicle constituted escalatory action that may violate community peace clauses. It summoned her to appear at a voluntary accountability session the following week, where she would be given the opportunity to present context for her decisions and demonstrate cooperative community values. Madeline read it once without blinking, then read it again out loud, this time with a voice dipped in disbelief. The phrasing was so performative it bordered on satire, but she recognized the tactic. These weren't just neighbors irritated by a gate or offended by autonomy. This was the calculated escalation of institutional pressure, a game of attrition where the goal was not legal victory but psychological fatigue. She placed the letter on her kitchen table, poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Outside, her land lay quiet. The gate stood freshly painted, its surface smooth and unmarred. The tractor rested in the equipment shed, grease still fresh from the previous day's maintenance. Everything around her bore the fingerprint of effort, ownership, responsibility. Yet, within the span of 2 weeks, she had become the target of a slow, strategic erosion of that sovereignty, all because a woman in a beige blazer didn't like the color red. She didn't attend the session. Instead, she had Decker draft a letter that challenged the legitimacy of the summons, reaffirmed her exemption from council oversight based on municipal zoning records, and formally warned against any further interference with her property or access. He sent it by courier, certified and time-stamped, and followed it up with a second document, this one addressed to the county clerk's office, requesting an official review of boundary encroachments and unauthorized attempts at extrajudicial enforcement by local associations. Madeline wasn't trying to win a fight. She was drawing lines in ink where others had tried to sketch them in fog. That weekend, 2 things happened in quick succession. First, she received a utility invoice, double her normal amount. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, but upon closer inspection noticed it included fees from shared usage systems, tied to the neighborhood's maintenance network. She didn't subscribe to that network. Her well was private, her septic independent. She contacted the utility office and was told a reclassification of her property had triggered the new charges, citing a form she had allegedly signed 2 months ago. She hadn't. The office sent her a scanned copy. Her name was there, typed neatly. Her signature wasn't. Decker filed an injunction the same day. The second event was stranger, more subtle, but it struck her harder. Early Sunday morning, just after dawn, she walked out to check her perimeter fencing and found a pile of branches, dirt, and broken bricks stacked just inside the south gate. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But it was arranged deliberately, like a cairn or marker. On top sat a plastic nameplate, snapped in 2, but still legible. It read, Community Safety Inspector. There was no wind that day, no storms the night before, no roadwork crews nearby. The pile hadn't arrived by chance. She spent the next hour walking the full border of her land, documenting everything with a handheld camera. At one point, she found shallow boot prints leading from the southern border into the adjacent scrubland. Barely visible, but clearly fresh. Someone had come in, left their message, and walked out. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't post about it online. Instead, she installed 2 more cameras, one facing the back acreage, the other mounted at the tree line near the south edge. Both fed to a secured drive, encrypted, stored off-site. That night, she sat in her living room with the lights off, watching the road from behind the curtains. The gate was locked. Her shotgun was loaded but untouched. She wasn't afraid. She was alert, her heartbeat steady, her body still. It wasn't the trespass that got to her. It was the realization that someone felt entitled enough to walk onto her land and leave a calling card without even attempting to hide. On Monday, she received her first official citation from the county, not the neighborhood. It accused her of unauthorized modifications to a community access route, referencing her use of the tractor to forcibly relocate a vehicle. The fine wasn't large, but the language was dangerous. Decker immediately requested a hearing, citing false claims and selective enforcement. But by then, the machine had already shifted into motion. Word spread. At the feed store, where no one usually talked unless you asked for help, she was greeted with silence. 2 old regulars who had once offered to help her lift hay bales now glanced away as she passed. One clerk refused to make eye contact. Later, she overheard 2 women whispering near the seed rack, tossing her name around with words like unstable, problematic, and not one of us. It wasn't just institutional pressure anymore. It was reputational isolation. Madeline wasn't naive. She knew communities could turn. She'd grown up in a small town where a girl had once been ostracized for wearing black to church, but the speed of it was dizzying. 1 gate, 1 color, and now she was the villain in a play she hadn't agreed to audition for. She didn't retreat. Instead, she filed a land use restriction application with the county zoning office, requesting formal reclassification of her property as a self-sufficient agricultural unit. It was a legal maneuver that would cement her independence and make future annexation attempts significantly more difficult. The paperwork was dense, the fees unpleasant, and the waiting period long. But it was a step, a real one, and it signaled something the council had not expected. She wasn't looking for compromise. She was building armor. That same week, she received a letter from an anonymous sender. No return address. Inside was a photograph, grainy, printed from a low-resolution camera. It showed her tractor, her gate, and the white sedan half in the ditch. Someone had taken the photo from a distance. Scrawled across the bottom in red pen were 4 words. You made your move. She didn't show the photo to Decker. She didn't need to. It wasn't evidence. It was bait. And Madeline, for all her stubbornness, wasn't about to start reacting like a cornered animal. She stayed quiet. She doubled her routines. She reinforced the gateposts with buried anchors, disguised under gravel. She added motion lights to the shed, reset the codes on her locks, and archived every piece of paper that came through her door. She wasn't at war, but if they wanted one, they'd find her ready. Not loud, not aggressive, but immovable. And in the dark, somewhere past the line of trees, someone was watching, waiting to see if she'd flinch. The morning that marked the shift from quiet retaliation to direct institutional aggression began, as so many did now, with a knock that wasn't a knock, a dull metal tap against her mailbox, followed by the soft shuffle of tires rolling away over gravel. Madeline opened the box to find not a letter this time, but an official-looking folder stamped with the county seal, the kind normally reserved for tax reassessments or permit disputes. Inside was a notice informing her that her land had been temporarily flagged for a zoning inquiry due to a community reclassification petition filed by the neighborhood council. The wording was careful, but the implication was obvious. The board was trying to get her land folded into their jurisdiction by way of administrative maneuvering. It wasn't a new tactic. Decker had warned her weeks earlier that something like this might come, but its arrival still hit with a certain finality. It meant they'd gone beyond color complaints and driveway blockades. Now they were reaching for the roots. Madeline didn't panic. She spent the next hour reviewing the county documents, cross-checking dates, signatures, and attached exhibits. Most of it was procedural smoke, proposed rezoning maps, mock-up development plans, impact assessments, but nestled among the bureaucracy was a letter of support from a private firm called East Wind Municipal Consultants, attesting that local sentiment favored unified aesthetic stewardship. The phrase struck her as both meaningless and dangerous. She'd seen it before, years ago, in a completely different context, on a different property hundreds of miles away, and it never meant anything good. She sent the entire packet to Decker, who called her within the hour, more frustrated than surprised. "They're trying to get it through on a non-contested zoning realignment," he explained. "If they get enough public record of agreement, signatures, letters, town hall minutes, they can push it through as a formality unless someone contests it with hard evidence. The fact that you're the one property on the fringe means they'll argue you're incidental to the change." He sighed. "It's sneaky, but legal, unless we make noise." Madeline didn't like noise, but she liked being erased even less. Together, they assembled a formal objection packet, complete with property maps, dated land use permits, photographic records of her existing fencing and gate installation, and a signed affidavit stating her land had been purchased and developed, independently, with no involvement in community plans. Decker submitted it directly to the county office, then followed up with a public request for a hearing, locking the process into a slower, more scrutinized track. It bought her time. Not safety, just time. The following day, she received a voicemail from a woman named Amber Carlisle, a county mediator. The message was pleasant but unmistakably strategic. A proposal for an informal sit-down, just to clarify positions and de-escalate potential misunderstandings. Madeline didn't return the call. She'd learned long ago that some conversations weren't meant to be had. They were meant to extract leverage, and there was nothing left to clarify. Later that week, she noticed a drone hovering above her property for the second time in as many days. It wasn't one of those hobbyist models either. It was the professional kind, black-bodied and quiet, outfitted with a gimbal and camera. It hovered just outside her fence line, tracing slow arcs above the southern field. She filmed it once, then again, documenting each flight with timestamp overlays, then sent both videos to Decker, who promised to add it to the growing list of exhibits for their zoning hearing. It was petty surveillance, no doubt designed to intimidate, but it also confirmed something important. They were watching closely enough to be worried. What they didn't know, or perhaps had forgotten, was that Madeline knew how to wait. She stopped leaving the property unless absolutely necessary. She let the lawn grow a little longer, not out of neglect, but principle. She installed a third camera, this one hidden inside a weatherproof bird box, and adjusted its motion settings to catch not just vehicles but movement along the tree line. When a man with a clipboard appeared at her gate a few days later, she didn't open it. She watched from a window, noting the fact that he spent several minutes pacing near the property boundary, pointing at various landmarks, as if matching them to a survey map. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked the fence, took notes, and left. The footage went straight to Decker. Then came the surprise. One morning, after a night of rain, Madeline found a fresh orange marker flag staked 3 feet inside her fence line. It wasn't hers. The plastic was new, the shaft clean. A few feet away, a second flag, then a third. A perfect line, slicing through her garden's edge like a quiet claim of ownership. She stood over them for several minutes, rain soaking through the knees of her jeans, staring at those little symbols of presumption. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't even subtle aggression. It was something worse, an attempt to redefine reality, to plant the idea that the boundary had always been there and that her fence was the problem. She pulled the flags out one by one, photographed them, bagged them, and mailed them to Decker with a handwritten note. They're trying to move the line before the hearing. That evening, the pressure changed. Karen returned, not with letters or messengers, but in person, this time accompanied by a new woman in a gray pantsuit who identified herself as legal counsel for the Community Oversight Board. They didn't cross the gate. They stood just beyond it, arms crossed, smiles pasted on with all the sincerity of a real estate agent's headshot. Karen did the talking. "There's still a window for cooperation," she said. "We're not here to fight. We're here to maintain harmony. All of this," she gestured broadly as if encompassing the world, "can be avoided with a simple show of goodwill. Paint the gate, align your fencing, attend the next community meeting. It's not so much to ask." Madeline stared back at them, silent. The woman in the pantsuit stepped forward slightly. "Failure to demonstrate good faith participation will be reflected in our official petition, and any additional resistance may be construed as obstruction." Madeline didn't raise her voice. She didn't move. She only said, "Then put that in writing, and we'll see what the court says." The two women exchanged a glance, then turned and left. There were no goodbyes. The next morning, one of Madeline's trail cameras recorded movement just past midnight. 3 individuals in dark clothing, no flashlights, moving quickly along the fence's south edge. They didn't approach the house. They didn't leave graffiti. They simply walked the length of the property and disappeared into the woods. She sent the footage to Decker. He didn't call back until the next day. "You need to consider putting in for a protection order," he said quietly. "This is beyond zoning. This is intimidation." "I know," she said. "Are you safe?" There was a pause. Then she answered, not softly, but calmly, "I'm not unprepared." She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. By that point, the fight wasn't about the gate anymore. It wasn't even about the land. It was about precedent, about whether a single, solitary person could still say no in a place where everyone else had learned to say yes, and whether silence and distance still counted as dignity rather than defiance. The line had been drawn. Now came the test of who would dare to cross it. The heavy skies above Dry Creek Ridge had been threatening rain for 3 days, and when it finally came, it did so with the slow, drenching confidence of a weather system that knew it wasn't in a hurry. "Oh." Madeline Horton sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee, watching droplets gather on the window pane and streak toward the sill. Her land drank it in. The gravel driveway darkened to a deep slate, her tilled rows behind the shed softened, and the wood of her fence let out quiet creaks as it swelled slightly from the moisture. In the distance, a hawk circled once, then disappeared behind the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the road was silent. No cars, no drones. No strangers with clipboards pretending to measure air quality or sound levels. The peace was heavy, expectant. She didn't trust it. She rose, pulled on her raincoat, and stepped outside, the smell of wet earth and cedar wrapping around her like a memory. Everything was in its place. The cameras were still live, their indicators steady. The garden tools leaned exactly where she'd left them, and the path to the gate was undisturbed until she reached the end. There, pressed into the mud just beyond the gate's reach, were fresh tire tracks. Not deep, not spinning, just settled impressions. Wide, smooth-treaded, and recent. Whoever had made them had turned around at the edge of her property, not driven in. But they had lingered, long enough for the rain to only partially erase the detail. She took photos and marked the distance to the nearest tree with a faded surveyor's flag. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but it was confirmation. They were still circling. Later that afternoon, as the rain eased into a misty drizzle, she heard the low growl of a car engine idling somewhere nearby. The sound was subtle, muffled by the wet air, but steady. She stepped onto her porch and scanned the road. Nothing in view. Yet the sound remained, faint but constant. It went on for nearly 10 minutes before cutting off abruptly, like someone had realized they'd been heard. Madeline stood motionless for another 5 before going back inside. The tension didn't lift. It settled deeper. That evening, as dusk settled in, a second letter arrived. This one slipped under her front door rather than delivered by mail. No envelope, no header, just 3 sentences typed in bold, sans serif font. You've been warned. Compliance is the only option. Next time, there will be consequences. No signature. No return address. The kind of letter that offered no help to the authorities but made its target perfectly aware of its message. She took a photo of it, scanned the original, then filed it into her growing folder labeled Notices, thicker now than most of her property tax returns. She didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. Instead, she made a list. By sunrise the next day, she had checked every camera feed, tested her locks, walked the fence line again, and, without ceremony, pulled the tractor out of the shed. It wasn't an act of escalation. It was presence. A declaration not made in words or lawsuits, but by putting mass and noise and horsepower on the land. It remained parked near the gate, off to the side, idling occasionally when she worked in the yard, visible from the road. It was enough to shift the mood, and apparently enough to provoke. 2 mornings later, she found deep gashes in the soil near her north fence, shovel marks, hastily covered, as if someone had tried to dig under the boundary line and thought better of it midway through. Near the marks was a trail of plastic ties, the kind used to hang temporary construction signage. She photographed them, flagged the location, and again updated Decker, who had by now begun assembling an informal dossier, just in case. But it was what happened 3 nights later that turned pressure into direct confrontation. At approximately 2:11 a.m., her Southern Trail camera recorded 3 figures moving quickly along her back property line. Unlike previous recordings, these figures wore reflective vests and carried flashlights angled downward. One of them paused near the corner fence post, bent down, and appeared to hammer something into the ground, an action followed by a brief flicker of what looked like a handheld scanner. Madeline didn't learn about it until morning, when she reviewed the footage over her first cup of coffee and felt the cold wash of violation settle into her gut. She printed stills, drove into town, and met with the county sheriff in person. To his credit, he didn't dismiss her. He reviewed the footage carefully, asked measured questions, and agreed to log an official trespassing report. But his tone made it clear what Madeline already suspected. Without identifiable faces or physical damage, there would be no investigation. Just a report. A placeholder. A bureaucratic whisper in a growing roar. She returned home and walked the fence line in daylight. There, where the figure had bent down, she found a freshly staked metal tag. Thin, anodized, with the letters CROSZN, etched along the top and a small barcode below. The kind used by municipal survey crews. It hadn't been there yesterday. She removed it, bagged it, and mailed it to Decker overnight. That night they came to her driveway again. She'd left the tractor idling just inside the gate after refueling it, the headlights off, the ignition live. At 3:12 a.m., her front camera caught the unmistakable form of a vehicle pulling in behind the gate. White, low profile, with the silhouette of a sedan she now recognized by shape alone. It paused there, headlights off, engine running. Then, as if daring her to react, it edged forward until its bumper pressed lightly against the closed gate. No honk, no exit, just pressure. Madeline didn't open the door. She didn't call anyone. She sat on the edge of her bed, her phone in one hand, her other resting against the old Winchester 30-30 mounted above her dresser. The vehicle remained there for 6 minutes, then backed up and disappeared. By dawn, the gravel where it had idled was soaked with oil, a slow drip that spoke of time spent waiting. And so, by noon the next day, Madeline made a decision. She typed a single-sentence email to Decker. Initiate protective injunction and immediate boundary enforcement. She then drove into the county office herself, submitted her notarized complaint, and purchased a stack of weatherproof signs. Private access. No trespassing. Violators will be recorded and prosecuted. She posted one every 25 feet along her fence, not because they would stop anyone, but because silence could no longer be mistaken for consent. The real shift came 48 hours later, when the council fired back. A courier arrived at 10 a.m. with a certified packet, a formal notice that a civil complaint had been filed against her by Karen Tilby, alleging deliberate endangerment, property damage, obstruction of shared municipal infrastructure, and psychological harassment. The claim referenced an incident involving a privately owned vehicle being aggressively displaced by heavy machinery, continued refusal to engage in peaceful dispute resolution, and an apparent campaign of intimidation. It was pure theater, but legally filed, and it required a response. A court date was set, depositions requested, evidence summoned. Madeline read it twice, handed it to Decker, and then went out back to check the generator lines, not because they were failing, but because she needed something mechanical to hold on to. They were trying to bleed her out, not in a single strike, but in court fees, appearances, and slow erosion. It wasn't a war of land anymore. It was a war of attrition, and she had just become their symbol of disobedience. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She spent that evening reviewing camera logs, photographing every fence post, checking every gate hinge, and logging every file into a hard drive labeled proof. Then, just before sundown, she climbed into the cab of her tractor, started the engine, and positioned it once more at the head of her drive. Not as a threat, as a statement. And though no words passed between her and those watching from behind the hedges or down the road, or inside their white sedans with sealed windows, she knew they heard it. The diesel hum, the refusal, the promise. The courtroom wasn't large, just 3 rows of benches, a wooden barrier between the gallery and the front, and a judge who looked like he'd been doing this long enough to know when a case was nonsense before opening the first page of the file. Yet still, everything about the setting felt surgical, cold, clean, quietly brutal in its formality. Madeline sat at the defense table beside Decker, whose usual tired sarcasm was now masked by professional stillness. Across the aisle, Karen Tilby looked like she had dressed for a political fundraiser. Navy blazer, pearl earrings, and a tight smile rehearsed to seem both patient and persecuted. Her attorney, a younger man with crisp hair and a folder full of color-printed photos, had already arranged them neatly in front of him. Madeline didn't glance at them. She knew what they'd show: the tractor, the gate, the drag sedan, and possibly a printout of her property marked up with red lines that didn't exist in real life. The case wasn't criminal, which was both a relief and a trap. Civil court meant damages, paperwork, and the illusion of diplomacy. It also meant that anyone could sue for anything, and if the paperwork looked scary enough, it could become a form of punishment all its own. The charges were absurd: reckless endangerment, damage to property, hostile behavior, but they were dressed in just enough formal language to slide past scrutiny if left unanswered. Decker, fortunately, had no intention of letting that happen. He opened with facts. The property line was legally documented, the vehicle had been trespassing, and Madeline had acted within her rights to remove the obstruction. He presented certified parcel maps, boundary affidavits, video stills, time-stamped footage, and the correspondence that led up to the incident. There was no embellishment, just a slow, deliberate stacking of facts. Karen's lawyer went second. He was smoother, more performative. He framed the situation as an escalating pattern of antisocial behavior, painting Madeline as a recluse who refused to cooperate with community norms, had a history of conflict, and used a piece of industrial machinery to threaten and damage private property. He showed a photo of the dragged car, now repaired, and argued that the act constituted a calculated display of force meant to intimidate others. He didn't mention that the car had been parked across a locked gate on private land. When pressed by the judge, he waved it off as a misunderstanding about shared access. Karen herself was called to testify. She spoke with the softness of someone pretending not to enjoy being in control, offering phrases like deeply concerned and community cohesion. She said Madeline's gate color had sparked unease among multiple homeowners, that her unwillingness to engage left the board no choice, and that the incident with the tractor left her emotionally shaken. When Decker stood to cross-examine, his voice was calm. He asked how long Karen had known that Madeline's property was not under community governance. She admitted it was unclear at first. He asked why the board had sent letters demanding changes when no legal authority existed over the land. She called them suggestions. He asked whether the car she referenced in her complaint had been parked on a public road or on private soil. She hesitated, then said, "It was meant to open dialogue." He ended with a question so dry it left a pause hanging in the room. Do you often park sedans in front of people's gates to start conversations?" The judge didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Madeline never had to speak. Decker had made sure of it. But she watched every moment. Quiet, steady, unmoved. She didn't care about their language or strategies. She cared about what would be left when the noise was done. When the judge called a recess to deliberate, Karen walked past her table with a glance designed to suggest patience. Madeline didn't return it. Her fingers stayed laced on the tabletop. Her boots planted. She wasn't interested in winning points. She was interested in being left alone. When court reconvened, the judge was brief. He dismissed the claim for lack of legal merit, citing improper jurisdiction, clear documentation of property boundaries, and the plaintiff's failure to demonstrate harm beyond speculative discomfort. He then added, almost as an afterthought, that the plaintiff's repeated attempts to influence behavior outside her scope of authority bordered on harassment. There would be no countersuit. Decker had advised against it, knowing how long such a battle could drag on. But the message was clear. Madeline had the law on her side. Her silence had not been an absence of power, but a choice not to waste energy fighting shadows. Outside, the sun had broken through the cloud line for the first time in days. Decker lit a cigarette and offered her one. She shook her head. He took a long drag and looked out toward the parking lot. "You handled that like a fence post in concrete," he said. Madeline didn't answer. She was watching Karen, who stood by her car across the lot, talking into a phone with one hand while using the other to gesture sharply toward nothing in particular. The performance had ended, but she still had an audience somewhere, someone who needed convincing that her plan hadn't just unraveled under fluorescent lights and a bored county judge. That night, Madeline sat on her porch as the wind picked up. Her property was quiet again. No cars. No papers, no shadows in reflective vests measuring where they didn't belong. The lights she'd mounted earlier flicked on with a gentle hum, illuminating the gate. Burgundy. Untouched. Just as she'd painted it. Just as it would remain. But the relief didn't come. Not yet. Because just after midnight, one of the southern cameras blinked. Not a glitch. Not wind. Movement. She pulled up the feed, expecting maybe a deer or another raccoon, but what she saw was smaller, human. A single figure wearing dark clothes, walking the fence line like they were memorizing it. They didn't stop to dig, didn't leave anything behind. They just walked, measured, studied, and then vanished back into the trees. Madeline didn't call Decker. She didn't call anyone. She simply saved the footage, archived it, and wrote down the time. The judge had settled the case. The law had spoken. But she knew better than to think this was finished, because people like Karen didn't stop when they lost. They shifted tactics. They whispered. they waited. And somewhere out there, in the quiet spaces between trees and laws and unspoken expectations, something else was beginning. Not an ending. A change in pressure. The days that followed the hearing carried an eerie kind of quiet. The kind that settles not out of peace but out of tension, pulled so tightly it stops vibrating. Madeline resumed her routines, feeding the dogs, walking the perimeter, checking her equipment, not because she expected normalcy to return, but because she knew that discipline was the only way to stay upright in a place where silence could mean anything. The air felt different now. The house creaked with the weight of watchfulness. Even the wind in the trees sounded suspicious, and though no more letters came, no more sedans parked across her gate, and no council agents dared to appear in person, the tension didn't lift. It just folded in on itself, deeper and quieter. Then, without warning, it broke. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, when the road filled with dust again. This time, it wasn't a lone car or clipboard envoy. It was a convoy. 2 county vehicles, an unmarked pickup, and a landscaping truck with a flashing orange beacon. They pulled up not at her gate, but just beyond her southern tree line, the part of the property that bordered the undeveloped parcel tied up in legal ambiguity. She watched from her porch, binoculars in hand, noting every badge, every shovel, every reflective vest. They weren't there for show. They were clearing brush, marking new lines, dragging plastic barriers into the undergrowth. One of the vehicles had Eastwind municipal markings. She didn't go down to confront them. Not this time. Instead, she called Decker. He arrived 3 hours later, dressed not like a lawyer but like a rancher. Jeans, boots, coat heavy with dust. They walked the perimeter together. The flags were back. Orange. Closer than before. Staked in a neat, sharp line running 20 yards inside her property, slicing directly through the southern field. Decker took photos, recorded timestamps, and nodded grimly. "They're doing a forced easement survey," he muttered, "trying to get access granted through public use precedent. If they build something, even temporary, they'll argue that it's de facto infrastructure." Madeline said nothing. She walked to the closest flag and pulled it out of the ground, holding it in her hand like a stripped bone. Then she turned and looked at the truck still idling in the trees. They hadn't entered her legal boundary yet, but they were building a paper trail, step by step, quiet enough to avoid headlines but steady enough to change maps. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, every light off, every camera feed live on her monitor. The wind had picked up, pushing against the side of the house like breath on glass. At 2:43 a.m., the southern camera lit up. Movement again. A single worker, hooded, carrying what looked like a tool bag, stepped into frame. He crouched near one of the earlier survey markers, adjusted something, and then planted a new metal post deeper into the soil, farther in. Oh, not a flag. A stake. Madeline didn't hesitate. She stood, put on her coat, walked outside, and mounted the tractor. The ignition rumbled to life like a long sleeping bear. She turned the machine slowly, the headlights off, the engine loud enough to send a message through the trees without needing words. By the time she reached the southern field, the figure was gone, but the post remained, shining under the moonlight, arrogant in its false claim. She didn't stop the tractor. The blade of the front loader caught the post dead center, bending it backward until it snapped with a metallic groan. Then she lowered the bucket, scraped the marker clean from the ground, and idled in place until the cameras picked up the retreating form of a man ducking through the brush. By dawn, Decker had submitted a cease and desist against Eastwind, attaching the footage, timestamps, and a demand for full review. He filed an emergency injunction to block any temporary construction or zoning activity within 100 yards of her southern boundary. It would take days to process, maybe weeks to be enforced. But it was filed, and that, at last, was the turning point. Because what came next wasn't more cars, more flags, or more veiled threats. It was silence, not just from Karen, who had not been seen since the courtroom, not just from the council, whose newsletter that week omitted her name for the first time in months, but from Eastwind. The consultants, the surveyors, the utility workers, they vanished. Whatever bluff they'd been pushing collapsed under the pressure of real legal scrutiny. The boundaries held, and Madeline, for the first time in weeks, breathed. Spring came early that year. The grass returned in thick tufts. The fencing held firm. The paint on the gate remained exactly the same shade of defiant burgundy. No one came to measure it again. She didn't host a celebration. She didn't call anyone. But one evening, just as the sun dropped behind the ridge, she walked out to the front post, carved a small plaque, and nailed it just under the latch. It read simply, "Private land, private line, decision made." She didn't expect visitors, but if they came, they'd understand exactly where they stood. And, more importantly, where she did.